He arrived at her Bristol office with a contract designed to strip her of everything she'd built, and the absolute certainty she'd sign it without reading. She had read every clause. She rejected 3 before he'd removed his gloves. Over the next 6 months, the coldest duke in England would discover that the widow he came to acquire was the only person alive who could save his fortune, and the only one who never once needed saving herself. Bristol, January 1817. The harbour office of Rowe and Associates occupied the second floor of a narrow building on King Street, wedged between a chandler's and a counting house that smelled permanently of tallow and anxiety. From the window, the one Diana Rowe stood at each morning before her clerk arrived, you could see 3 ships at anchor, the mouth of the Avon, and, on clear days, the suggestion of Wales. It was not a view that impressed visitors. It was a view that told her every morning exactly what she had and exactly what she stood to lose. She was at the window when the Duke of Haverford's carriage turned onto King Street. She had been expecting it. His solicitor's letter had arrived 4 days prior, and she had spent those 4 days doing what the letter clearly assumed she would not, reading the attached contract with attention, pricing every clause, and identifying the 3 that would, if signed as written, quietly transfer operational authority over her Bristol routes to Haverford within 18 months. The language was elegant. That was what made it dangerous. She watched the carriage stop. A footman descended first, then a man she recognized from description as Haverford's solicitor, Mr. Fitch, thin, careful, the kind of man who wrote elegant, dangerous language for a living. Then the Duke himself. He was taller than she had expected. He stood on King Street and looked up at the building with an expression she could not read from 2 floors up, but which she suspected was not admiration. He straightened his cuffs. He said something to Fitch. Then he came inside. Diana turned from the window, sat down behind her desk and opened the ledger. They kept her waiting. Not long, 3 minutes, perhaps 4, but long enough that she understood it was deliberate. Her clerk, Thomas, showed them up with the expression he reserved for situations he found professionally alarming, which was to say, his face was entirely neutral. His Grace the Duke of Haverford, Thomas said, and Mr. Fitch. Edmund Cavendish entered the room the way she imagined he entered every room, as though it had been arranged for his arrival. He was, she observed, exactly the sort of man who had never needed to wonder whether he belonged somewhere. Tall, dark-coated, his face arranged in an expression of courteous attention that contained underneath no curiosity whatsoever. He looked at her desk. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Mrs. Rowe. He did not bow. He inclined his head, which was a different thing, the acknowledgement one offered an inconvenience one intended to resolve. Your Grace. She rose because manners cost nothing, and gestured to the 2 chairs across from her. Please sit. Fitch sat immediately. Haverford took a moment, 1 beat longer than necessary, the kind of pause that was also a statement, and then sat. I trust the journey from London was comfortable, Diana said. Adequate, said Haverford. She had offered refreshment in her reply to Fitch's letter. None was requested. She did not offer it again. I imagine you have reviewed the contract, Haverford said. It was not quite a question. I have. Then we can proceed directly. He nodded to Fitch, who produced a copy and set it on the desk between them. Diana did not look at it. She already knew every word. I have some observations, she said. Something moved in Haverford's expression. So briefly she might have missed it, except that she had spent 18 months reading men who did not expect to be read. By all means, he said. She opened the ledger, found the page she had marked, and turned it to face him across the desk. Her annotations ran down the margin in clear, close handwriting. Clause numbers, projected figures, 2 questions underlined in red. Clause 7, she said, the arbitration provision. As written, any dispute over route allocation is resolved by a panel whose members are nominated by the senior license holder. That is currently you, and would remain you for the duration of the initial term. Standard practice, Fitch said. In contracts between parties of equivalent standing, yes. She looked at Fitch pleasantly. This contract is not between parties of equivalent standing. Clause 7, as written, ensures it never becomes so. Fitch opened his mouth. Haverford raised 1 finger fractionally, and Fitch closed it again. What would you propose instead? Haverford said. Joint nomination. Each party names 1 panelist. Those 2 select a third from a pre-agreed list which we compile together before signing. Haverford looked at her for a moment. That slows resolution considerably. It prevents resolution from being indistinguishable from annexation. She turned a page. Clause 12. They were there for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Diana knew because she had wound the clock on the mantelpiece herself that morning and watched it from the corner of her eye as the meeting progressed. Haverford had brought a contract designed to be signed in 40 minutes. He had not, she suspected, brought enough patience for 2 hours. He did not show it. She would grant him that. His face remained arranged in its expression of courteous attention throughout, even when she walked him through the projected tonnage figures on the India route and demonstrated, with her own sourced numbers, that his solicitor had undervalued her Bristol contacts by approximately 30%. Fitch grew visibly uncomfortable at that point. Haverford did not. "Where did you source those figures?" he asked. "From the merchants themselves. You spoke to them directly?" "They are my contacts," she said. "Yes." He looked at her ledger again. She had referenced it 4 times over the course of the meeting, and each time she reached for it, his gaze went to it, before it went back to her. It was a plain thing, the ledger. Brown leather, well used. Her husband's name had been on the spine once. She had covered it with a strip of new leather 2 months after his death, when she understood that conducting business as the vessel of a dead man's reputation would serve her only so long. "The figures in there," Haverford said. "Are they your husband's records?" "No," Diana said. "They are mine." He did not reply immediately. She watched him recalibrate, not his expression, which did not change, but something behind it. "We will require time to review your proposed amendments," he said at last. "Of course." She closed the ledger. "I have drafted the alternative clauses in writing. Thomas will give Mr. Fitch a copy as you leave." Fitch blinked. Haverford's eyes moved to her face with the particular attention of a man who had just realized the meeting had gone differently from how he had planned it, and was deciding whether to acknowledge this. He decided not to. "Good day, Mrs. Rowe." "Good day, Your Grace." She stood. He stood. He was already moving toward the door when he paused, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her desk. The ledger was closed. Her hands were flat on either side of it. "The India route figures," he said. "I should like to see the sourcing documentation. I will have it sent." He nodded once and left. Diana waited until she heard the carriage door, then crossed to the window. Below on King Street, Haverford emerged from the building and paused again on the step. He said something to Fitch. Fitch replied. Haverford looked up at the building, not at the window specifically, she was certain he could not see her, and then got into the carriage. She watched the carriage until it turned the corner. Then she opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote, Clause 7 conceded, Clause 12 to negotiate, Clause 19 do not move. That evening, at the house on Queen Square that was too large for one person and too full of her late husband's furniture for her to feel entirely at home in, Diana ate supper at the writing desk in the parlour and read through the contract a 5th time. Robert had bought the house 6 years ago, at the height of what he had called his prospects, which had turned out to mean the beginning of his debts. She had not known that then. She had been 23, and he had been charming, and the house had seemed like evidence of something solid. She knew now what it was evidence of. She had spent a year sorting through it. She turned to Clause 19 and read it again. It was the most important clause in the document, and also the least conspicuous. 3 sentences, buried between the penalty provisions and the force majeure section, that would, if signed, grant Haverford right of first refusal on any future sale of the business. Not just the partnership, the whole of Rowe and Associates. It was the clause Fitch had written thinking she would not read that far, or if she did, that she would not understand what she was reading. She had understood what she was reading before she reached the end of the first sentence. She closed the contract, drank the last of her tea, and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the too large bed in the too large house and thought about the way Haverford had looked at the ledger, and about the pause at the door, and about the fact that a man who sent elegant, dangerous contracts and expected them to be signed in 40 minutes had stayed for 2 hours and 11 minutes without losing his composure once. That was not what she had expected. She was not certain yet whether it was better or worse. Bristol and London, February-March 1817. His response to her proposed amendments arrived in 8 days, which was faster than she had expected. The letter was from Fitch, not from Haverford, which was what she had expected. Clauses 7 and 12 were accepted, with minor modifications she found acceptable. Clause 19 was not addressed. She wrote back the following morning. She addressed the letter to Mr. Fitch and made no mention of the Duke. She proposed a meeting in London at his convenience, at a location of his choosing, to resolve the outstanding provisions. She named 3 dates in the 2nd week of February. The reply came in 5 days. The meeting was confirmed for the 14th, at Haverford's London solicitor's office on Gray's Inn Road. The letter was signed by Fitch. At the bottom, in different handwriting, blacker, more compressed, someone had added, "The India sourcing documentation was satisfactory. H." Diana read that line twice. Then she filed the letter and began preparing for London. She took the coach. She could not yet afford the alternative, and she was not yet in the habit of pretending otherwise, which was one of the things that distinguished her from most of the people she was about to spend a week among. London received her with its usual February indifference. Grey sky, grey streets, the Thames smelling of everything that had been thrown into it since the Romans left. She stayed at a small hotel near Holborn, respectable enough for her purposes, expensive enough that no one asked questions. She spent the evening before the meeting reviewing the documentation she had brought and eating bread and soup at the small table by the window, listening to the city outside. The Gray's Inn office was everything a solicitor's office should be. Dark wood, ordered papers, the faint smell of sealing wax and professional discretion. Fitch was already there when she arrived. Haverford arrived 4 minutes later, which she suspected was intentional. Not rudeness, but the establishment of sequence, the small grammar of who waited for whom. "Mrs. Rowe," he said. "Your Grace." She had the ledger on the table in front of her, open. His eyes went to it. She had noticed in Bristol that his eyes always went to it. She had not yet decided what to do with that information. They worked through the outstanding clauses for 90 minutes. Fitch spoke often. Haverford spoke less, but when he spoke it was to the point, and twice he overruled Fitch on positions Diana had raised, in a way that suggested he had considered them in advance, and already concluded she was correct. She found this more unsettling than opposition would have been. Clause 19 remained. "I notice," Diana said, when they had resolved everything else, "that the right of first refusal provision has not been addressed." Fitch cleared his throat. "It is standard." "It is not standard in this configuration," she said. "A right of first refusal on the whole of my business, not merely the partnership assets, is not a commercial provision. It is an exit mechanism designed to limit my options if the partnership fails." She looked at Haverford. "I assume you understand the distinction." "I do," Haverford said. "Then I trust you'll understand why I won't sign it." A pause. Fitch looked at his papers. Haverford looked at Diana. "Remove it," he said to Fitch. Fitch looked up. "Your Grace, the intention was—" "I am aware of the intention. Remove it." It was the first time she had seen him disagree with his own solicitor. She watched him do it without heat, without explanation, as though the decision had already been made, and the only remaining task was to communicate it. Fitch removed his spectacles, polished them, and made a note. "Thank you," Diana said. "It was indefensible," Haverford said. He said it as though he were observing the weather. "I do not require indefensible provisions." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you do." The social event was not her idea. One of her London contacts, a merchant's wife named Mrs. Albright, who had known Robert and had transferred her goodwill to Diana with gratifying efficiency after his death, had invited her to a dinner on the 16th, and Diana had accepted before she knew Haverford would also be present. She learned this from Mrs. Albright's note of confirmation, which mentioned him in a subordinate clause, as though his attendance were no more significant than the menu. She went anyway. To cancel would have been noticed. It was a dinner of 14, in a Portman Square house that was warm and well lit and full of exactly the kind of people Diana had been navigating for 18 months. Merchants with ambitions above their station, minor gentry with ambitions below their income, and a small number of people who were simply curious about everything and could be found at any gathering if the food was good enough. Haverford was in the last category, she suspected, though he would not have described himself in any category at all. He arrived after her. She was in conversation with a shipping agent named Morrison when she heard the slight recalibration of noise that accompanied his entrance. Not silence exactly, but the particular social adjustment of a room acknowledging rank. She did not look up immediately. When she did, he was across the room speaking to their host, and he had not yet seen her. She returned to her conversation with Morrison. The table seated 14, and Diana found herself 4 places from Haverford's end, between Morrison and a quietly clever woman named Mrs. Hartley, whose husband ran a textile concern in the Midlands and who wanted to discuss canal investment, which Diana found genuinely interesting. Haverford was between Mrs. Albright and the young baronet, whose name Diana had not caught at the introduction. She had been talking with Mrs. Hartley about the Kennet and Avon Canal's toll structure for some minutes, when the table reached one of those lulls. Several conversations pausing simultaneously, the particular silence of 14 people momentarily running out of things to say at once. In that gap, she heard Haverford's voice quite clearly from 4 places away. He was speaking to the baronet, in the unhurried tone of a man saying something he considered self-evident. The difficulty is that sentimentality makes poor commerce. A woman left a business by her husband is not the same as a woman who built one. The nursery, not the boardroom, is where instinct leads. A small pause. In the general case, naturally. The baronet laughed. Diana did not move. She was aware of Morrison beside her, going very slightly still. She was aware of Mrs. Hartley's eyes moving briefly to her face. She lifted her wineglass and drank from it, and returned it to the table and asked Mrs. Hartley a question about the toll revision proposed for the following year, and Mrs. Hartley, who was a perceptive woman, answered her. Haverford had not looked in her direction. He did not know she had heard. She made a note of that too. The carriage situation arose from a collision of bad timing and worse weather. It had been raining since 7, and by the time dinner concluded at 10:30, the streets were filthy enough that 2 of the departing guests shared vehicles rather than wait for their own. Diana's hired hack had not arrived. Haverford's carriage was at the door. Mrs. Albright, with the cheerful ruthlessness of a woman who considered herself a social engineer, proposed the arrangement before Diana could decline it. Haverford passes Holborn entirely. It is no inconvenience. None, Haverford said. He said it smoothly, which meant he had decided to be gracious before she had the opportunity to refuse. She got in the carriage. It was well sprung, warm, and entirely silent for the first 2 minutes. The rain was loud on the roof. Diana watched the city pass the window and did not look at him. He was on the opposite seat, and she was aware of him with the particular awareness of someone who has decided not to be aware. "You heard what I said at dinner," he said. She turned her head. He was looking at her directly, which was not what she had expected. "I did," she said. He said nothing for a moment. The carriage moved through a narrow street and the lamplight came and went across his face. "I spoke without knowledge of the full company," he said. "That was careless." It was the closest thing to an apology that his construction admitted. She recognized the form, the acknowledgement of error framed as a procedural lapse rather than a moral one. She had heard Robert use the same form, but Robert had used it to foreclose discussion. Haverford, she noticed, had left it open. "It would have been the same observation," she said, "had you known." He did not deny it. "Yes," he said, "it would." The rain continued. She looked back at the window. "The India documentation," she said. "Your note said it was satisfactory." "It was more than satisfactory." A pause. "The contacts along the Calcutta route, 3 of those names were unknown to my own agents." "Your agents speak to agents," Diana said. "I speak to merchants." "I see the distinction." "Do you?" It was not quite a question. He heard what it wasn't. The carriage slowed for a crossing, and in the pause she felt him looking at her profile, and then looking away. "Your husband cultivated those contacts," he said. "Robert cultivated the idea of contact," she said. "I made them useful." The carriage stopped at her hotel. The footman opened the door. She gathered her things and moved to step out, and he said without inflection, "The Bristol meeting. I propose the 4th of March." "The 6th suits me better," she said. "The 6th, then." She stepped down and the door closed, and the carriage moved away through the rain. She stood on the wet step for a moment before going inside. She was not thinking about the Bristol meeting. She was back in Bristol on the 6th of March in her own office, the ledger open on the desk, and 3 new pages of notes added to it since London. Haverford arrived on time, without Fitch. That was new. "No solicitor," she said. "The outstanding items are commercial, not legal." He sat. "Unless you prefer to have counsel present." "No." She found the marked page. "Shall we begin with the commission structure?" They worked for 3 hours. Without Fitch, the pace was different, faster and also more direct, because there was no one to speak for either of them, which meant they spoke for themselves. Haverford argued when he argued, precisely and without heat. So did she. He conceded 2 points in the morning and won 1 after the noon hour, and the point he won was one she had been prepared to concede anyway, which she did not tell him. Midway through the afternoon, they reached the supplier terms. A Bristol firm named Haskell & Son that Diana had been using for rope and canvas since Robert's time, and that Haverford wanted replaced with a London firm he had used for years. "Haskell's prices are higher," he said. "By 4%, she said, "against which they deliver on the agreed date every time without exception, which I have verified over 11 transactions." She turned the ledger. "Your London firm, Thornton's." I looked them up. 3 late deliveries in the past year, documented in the Bristol merchant records. He looked at the page. "Where did you find the merchant records?" "I asked for them." He sat back in his chair. It was a small movement, barely a shift, but she had been watching him long enough now to know it meant he was revising something. "Haskell's," he said. 4% premium." "Yes." "Acceptable." She wrote it down. The room was quiet except for the scratch of her pen and the sound of the harbour outside, the creak and knock of ships at anchor. "How long have you kept it?" he said. She looked up. He was looking at the ledger. "Since the month after Robert died," she said. "Before that I kept notes, but not systematically." "You taught yourself to do this." "Robert's man of business showed me the rudiments. The rest I arrived at by requirement." He looked at it for a long moment, not at her, at the ledger. "May I?" he began. "No," she said pleasantly. He accepted this without visible reaction. She found to her own mild surprise that she liked him slightly better for not pretending the question had been about something else. They finished at 4. He stood, collected his coat, and paused at the door. The same pause as January, the same hand on the frame. She had begun to think of it as his habit, the pause at the threshold, the look back that was not quite casual. "The commission figures," he said. "Your projected tonnage for the second year, they are ambitious." "They are accurate," she said. "I hope so," he said, and left. She crossed to the window. Below King Street was grey and ordinary in the March afternoon. She watched him emerge and get into the carriage without looking up. Then she opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date, and under it, "Third meeting. No solicitor. Haskell's, conceded without argument once shown the records. Note, he reads figures before he reads people, but he does read both." She paused, then added, "Clause 19, he removed it himself without being asked twice." She looked at what she had written for a moment, then closed the ledger and went to find Thomas to arrange the fair copy of the agreed terms. London, April 1817. The partnership was provisionally agreed on the 22nd of March in a document that ran to 14 pages and contained, to Diana's satisfaction, not a single clause she had not approved. The formal signing was set for May, pending final review by both parties' legal representatives. In the meantime, there was the work of building the thing they had agreed to build. This required, as Haverford's letter of the 25th explained, a period of coordinated planning. Supplier arrangements, route schedules, the introduction of Diana's merchant contacts to Haverford's licensing agents, and the reverse, the navigation of Crown license procedures that Diana had never needed to understand because she had never been permitted to hold a license herself. His letter was precise and practical and ended with a proposed schedule of 4 meetings per week, rotating between his Mayfair house on Monday and Wednesday, the offices of their shared solicitor on Chancery Lane on Tuesday, and her lodgings near Holborn on Friday. Diana read the schedule and found it efficient, and said so in her reply. She also wrote that same afternoon to a Bristol solicitor named Hartley, recommended by Mrs. Hartley, who had mentioned him at the February dinner, regarding a matter she wished to discuss before the May signing. The matter concerned the legal structure of Rowe & Associates under certain potential future circumstances. She asked Hartley to treat the inquiry with discretion. He wrote back within the week to say that he was familiar with equitable trust arrangements of the kind she described, that they were entirely achievable, and that he would be glad to discuss the particulars at her convenience. She filed his letter at the back of the ledger and went to pack her trunks for London. His house was in Grosvenor Street, tall, white-fronted, the kind of house that had always looked like that and intended to continue doing so. She arrived the first Monday morning at 10, was shown up by a butler of impeccable blankness, and was taken to a study on the first floor that she had not expected to find comfortable. It was, however, comfortable. Books on 3 walls, a large desk, 2 good chairs angled near the window, a fire which she appreciated because April in London was still cold in the mornings. The desk had been cleared to a working surface, and on it were the route maps she had sent ahead, and the licensing documentation she had not yet seen, arranged in a logical order that suggested he had read them. He was there when she arrived, which was also not what she had expected. She had thought he would make her wait, not from discourtesy, but from habit. "Mrs. Rowe," he rose, there was no performance in it. "To your grace." She sat, put the ledger on the table and looked at the maps. "You have already sorted the licensing documents. There are 3 categories that require separate handling." He sat. "I thought it would save time." She looked at the 3 piles. He had categorized them correctly. She could see that immediately, and she had not told him the categories. "You worked this out yourself," she said. "Last night." A pause that was almost nothing. "The logic is apparent from the dates." She decided not to comment on this and turned to the first pile. They worked well together. She had known they would, had suspected it since the second meeting in London, when she had first seen him argue without ego, concede without theatre. But knowing a thing in theory and discovering it in practice were different, and the discovery was mildly disorienting. To sit across a working desk from someone who read at the same pace she did, who asked questions only when he did not know the answer, who never repeated a point once it had been registered. Robert had repeated points, loudly and more slowly, and with the patient emphasis of a man explaining things to someone unlikely to understand them. She had understood them. She had understood all of them. At noon, a footman brought coffee without being summoned. Haverford had arranged it in advance. She accepted the cup, drank it, and said nothing. He was reading a supplier contract and said nothing either. It was a very quiet noon hour. The second week's meetings confirmed the rhythm. Monday and Wednesday at Grosvenor Street, Tuesday at Chancery Lane, Friday at her Holborn lodgings, where the sitting room was smaller and less furnished, but had a writing table that suited her better than anything in the solicitor's offices. He arrived at her lodgings on the first Friday of April, with his own documents already organized and, she noticed, without a secretary. "You do not bring a secretary," she observed. "I find dictating to someone in the room changes what I say," he said. She looked at him. He was removing his coat, which the hotel's footman had apparently failed to intercept, and laying it over the back of the second chair. "Yes," she said, "it does." He sat, she sat. They opened their respective documents. She had noticed him noticing things. She had noticed this in Bristol, and she had noted it in the ledger, and she had continued noting it in London because it had not stopped. He noticed when she reached for the ledger and what page she turned to. He noticed when she was uncertain, not from her face, which she had learned to keep even, but from what she did with her pen when she was thinking, which was to hold it without writing. He noticed when she was tired, because she became quieter, and he had begun in the last 2 meetings to ask for a recess at the correct moment without being asked. She was not certain what to do with the fact that he was paying that quality of attention. She had catalogued it, as she catalogued everything. She had not reached a conclusion. There was also, she was beginning to understand, a question she would need to answer before May. Hartley's letter sat at the back of the ledger, and she had read it 3 times in the fortnight since it arrived. An equitable trust, properly drawn, would preserve Rowe and Associates as her sole and separate property, regardless of any future change in her personal circumstances. It was a legal mechanism, nothing more. That it had occurred to her to investigate it at all was a fact she had not yet examined. She had not yet examined it because she was not ready to examine what it implied. The argument that was also not an argument happened on the second Tuesday of April at Chancery Lane, over a minor routing question, whether to prioritize the Calcutta run or the Bombay connection in the first operating year. It was a genuine disagreement. She had numbers favoring Calcutta, he had relationships favoring Bombay, and neither set of evidence was conclusive. They argued for 40 minutes. Not loudly. Neither of them argued loudly, but with the full attention of 2 people who were used to being the most informed person in the room and had discovered they were no longer certain of that. He won. She conceded when he produced correspondence from a Bombay factor that she had not seen and could not immediately counter. She said, "That changes the calculation," and wrote it down and moved on. He watched her write it down. "You concede quickly," he said, "when the evidence requires it. I have no interest in being wrong for longer than necessary." "No." Something in his voice, not his usual register, lower and more considered. "Neither do I." She looked up from the ledger. He was looking at her, and he did not immediately look away, which was unusual. She felt the quality of the room shift, or rather, she felt that she was aware of it in a way she had been, with some care, avoiding. She looked back at the ledger. "The Bombay factor. We should request updated terms before the May signing." "I'll write to him today," Haverford said, and they moved on. He found the ledger on the 4th Tuesday of April. She had stepped out of his study. They had moved to Grosvenor Street for the day, the Chancery Lane offices being occupied by another matter, to speak to the butler about a document that had been delivered from the Bristol solicitor. A 5-minute errand, no more. When she came back, he was at the desk, and the ledger was open in front of him. He was not reading it casually. He was reading it the way she read documents, with attention, his head slightly forward, one finger moving along the margin. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. For the first time since she had known him, she saw something cross his face that was not controlled. It was not guilt precisely. It was closer to being seen doing something that mattered more than he intended. He closed the ledger. He set it back in precisely the position it had been in. He did not apologize. "The Haskell notation," he said. "In March. You wrote that I read figures before I read people." She crossed to the desk and sat down. "Yes. Do you consider that a flaw?" "I consider it a method," she said. "Whether it is a flaw depends on whether the person eventually gets read." He looked at her. She had the distinct impression that he was deciding something. "And do I," he said, "eventually get read?" "You are being read now," she said. He said nothing. She opened the ledger to the day's page and began writing the date, and after a moment he picked up his own documents and they resumed. The step happened on the last Wednesday of April. It was evening. They had run longer than usual, finishing a complex licensing registration that required both their signatures and 3 separate witnesses, which had necessitated 2 additional people being brought in and had extended the session by 2 hours. It was dark by the time the witnesses left, and Diana was pulling on her coat in the entrance hall of Grosvenor Street when she caught her heel on the uneven edge of the bottom step. The flagstone was slightly raised. She saw it a half-second too late. His hand closed around her arm before she had finished losing her balance. It was not a dramatic recovery. She had not been about to fall badly, a stumble no more. But his hand was there and she was steady, and he did not immediately let go. She looked at his hand on her arm. He looked at it also. "The stone," he said. "I have told them repeatedly." "Thank you," she said. He released her arm. He did it the way he did everything, without fuss, with complete composure, and held the door open, and she walked through it into the April evening. In the street, the hackney was waiting. She got in and told the driver Holborn and sat back against the seat and looked at her gloved arm where his hand had been. She did not write it in the ledger that night. She was not yet sure what category it belonged to. The last scene of April was the evening she left the ledger behind. It was an accident the first time. She had left it on the desk at Grosvenor Street when they finished on a Monday, and she had not noticed until she was in bed at the hotel that night. She sent a note in the morning asking Thomas, who was in London now, managing her correspondence, and increasingly she had been arranging the day-to-day operational matters at King Street that did not require her direct hand, to collect it. Haverford's reply arrived before Thomas could leave. "I will bring it Friday, H." It was the first note he had sent her that was not about business. She read it twice, and then she put it on the pile with the others. On Friday he arrived at her Holborn sitting room and set the ledger on the table without comment, and she said thank you, and they opened their documents and began to work. Halfway through the morning, she reached for the ledger and realized she was not going to open it. She had the figures in her head, had had them since Tuesday, and she left it closed on the corner of the table. Thomas, meanwhile, was proving precisely what she had suspected he would prove when she began redirecting the harbour correspondence through him, that he was thorough, discreet, and entirely capable of managing the operational rhythm of King Street without her at the desk each morning. The contacts remained hers, the intelligence, the decisions, the negotiations that mattered, all of it remained hers. But the daily management, The supplier receipts, the crew schedules, the ledger entries that did not require her particular eye. Thomas was doing those now, and doing them well. And this was not a retreat. It was a structure, one she had been building deliberately, and which would need to be fully in place before May. When Haverford arrived on the following Monday at Grosvenor Street, she put the ledger on the desk as usual. But she noticed, as the morning went on, that she reached for it less. The numbers were inside her now, more than in the book. They had been for a while. She left the ledger on his desk when she left on Wednesday evening. She thought about going back for it at the corner of Grosvenor Street, and kept walking, and did not examine why. On Thursday, she wrote to Hartley in Bristol, and told him she was ready to discuss the trust arrangement in full. She asked him to prepare the initial documents. Then she sealed the letter, and gave it to Thomas and went back to work. Part 4. The Turn. London, May 1870. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, written in Haverford's hand rather than a secretary's, which she noticed before she noticed anything else about it. Mrs. Rowe, I am hosting a small dinner on Thursday evening, primarily for the benefit of a Mr. Gerald Ashworth, whose import connections along the Cape route would be of material use to our first operating year. I would be grateful for your attendance. 7 o'clock. Haverford. She wrote back the same afternoon. Your Grace, Thursday suits D. Rowe. She looked at the initial for a moment after she had written it, then folded the note and gave it to Thomas. She arrived at Grosvenor Street at 7 precisely to find Haverford in the entrance hall, which was not where hosts usually stood. He was speaking to his butler with the focused attention of a man resolving a problem, and when she entered, he looked up and said without preamble, Ashworth has cancelled. When? An hour ago. His wife is unwell. I see. She stood in the entrance hall with her coat still on. Then I will... Stay, he said. And then, as though he heard the word differently once it had left him, the cook is already prepared for 2, it would be wasteful. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression he used when he had said something he was not going to retract, and was waiting to see whether she would make him. She handed her coat to the footman. The dining room at Grosvenor Street was designed for large numbers and felt with 2 people at one end of a table built for 12, like a room making a point. After 10 minutes, Haverford said, This is absurd, and told the footman to have the covers moved to the library. The library was smaller, warmer, and had a fire that had been burning for hours. The table they ate at was a round one near the window, a reading table really, pressed into service. It was, Diana thought, sitting down, the most comfortable room she had been in since leaving Bristol. You did not tell me you had a library, she said. You did not ask. I assumed the books in your study were your library. Those are the working books. He gestured at the shelves around them. These are the others. She looked. History, philosophy, natural science, a long run of bound periodicals, and on the lower shelf nearest the fire, what appeared to be 3 novels. Yours? She said, nodding at the novels. Something crossed his face. My wife's, he said. Late wife, I have not moved them. She looked at the shelf. I did not know you had been married. 4 years ago. She died in childbed, the child also. I am sorry, she said. It was not... He stopped. It was a long time ago, he said, which was not what he had started to say. The footman served the first course. They ate for a moment in silence that was not uncomfortable. Your husband, Haverford said. You said in the carriage in February that it was not a love match. I said that in the carriage, she said. Yes. What was it? She considered him across the small table. In all their weeks of meetings, he had never asked her a personal question, had never, she suspected, allowed himself to. This one had arrived without his usual premeditation. It was a practical arrangement, she said. On his part, I was young and well connected in the Bristol merchant community through my father. He needed what that connection represented. She picked up her fork. I was also, I believe, decorative enough to be convenient socially. Neither of us made the mistake of calling it more than it was. That is a very composed account. I have had time to compose it. Were you unhappy? She looked up. He was watching her with the specific quality of attention he usually directed at documents, complete, unsentimental, genuinely wanting the accurate answer. I was often alone, she said. Robert spent his time in London, or in negotiations I was not party to, or in company that did not include me. I ran the Bristol house and received his correspondence and managed what was, though I did not then know it, the more solvent half of his operations. She paused. I was not unhappy, precisely, I was underused. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Yes, Haverford said, I imagine you were. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and she had the sudden, clear impression that he was being careful, that he had arrived at something he had not expected to arrive at, and was proceeding with the particular caution of a man who could not see the ground below him. Your wife, she said. What was it for you? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he would not answer. She was kind, he said. She was very young and she was kind and she did not deserve what happened to her. What it was for me, he paused. I was a great deal more composed about it than I should have been, at the time. That is not something I have examined with satisfaction. She said nothing. He turned from the fire and looked at her. You are the first person I have said that to, he said. I will not repeat it, she said. I know, he said. And then, as though he had surprised himself, I know. The footman cleared the first course and brought the second and withdrew. The fire settled. Outside the library windows, Grosvenor Street was quiet in the May evening, and the room held the particular warmth of a space that had been lived in rather than maintained. She told him about her father, who had been a Bristol merchant of the industrious second rank, and who had taught her figures at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings because he had no sons, and she was present and interested. Haverford told her about a tutor at 12 who had been the first person to hold him to intellectual account, and about the particular quality of that experience for a boy who had been held to no account at all. You were indulged, she said. Comprehensively, he said. It is not I have found a preparation for anything useful. And yet here you are. And yet here I am. He turned his wine-glass in his hand, being corrected on supplier assessments by a woman in a Bristol harbour office. Being corrected accurately, she said. Being corrected accurately, he agreed. She looked at him across the small table. He was not the man who had walked into her office in January, or rather, he was, because his fundamental shape had not changed, and would not. He was still cold in rooms full of people, still capable of silence as a form of pressure, still the kind of man who had never needed to wonder whether he belonged. But sitting here in his own library, at a reading table pressed into service, he was those things at rest. She had not seen him at rest before. He was looking at her with an expression she had not catalogued. She had catalogued most of his expressions by now, had a taxonomy of them: the professional attention, the controlled disagreement, the revision of position look, the door-frame pause. This was not any of those. Diana, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. Not Mrs. Rowe, not the impersonal address of a business partner, just her name, in his voice, which was lower than usual. She did not look away. Yes. He stood and she stood, and neither of them was certain afterward who had moved first. What she would remember was the fire behind him and the ledger on the corner of the table. She had brought it from habit, set it down when the covers were moved to the library, and it had been there all evening, closed and forgotten. And then the ledger was not what she was looking at. He kissed her. She kissed him back. His hands were on her face, careful, like a man handling something he was afraid to damage. And hers were at his lapels, and the fire crackled, and the books were on their shelves, and the late wife's novels were on the lower shelf near the hearth, and none of it was an accident. When they stepped back, it was not because either of them wanted to. It was because the room needed acknowledging. She looked at him. He looked at her. That was not planned, he said. No, she said, I know. I want to. He stopped. She had never heard him stop in the middle of a sentence. I do not want to make this into something it ought not to be yet. Then don't, she said. He looked at her carefully. I am not practiced at this. Neither am I. A pause. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a small gesture, a domestic one, entirely out of place with everything she knew of him, and entirely, she thought, in keeping with what she was discovering. They sat back down. The footman came in with the dessert course, and appeared to notice nothing, which Diana suspected was a professional miracle. They ate, and the candles burned lower, and the conversation moved, not with effort but with the ease of two people who had been talking about practical matters for 4 months, and had discovered, without planning to, that they were also capable of other kinds of talking. About nothing of consequence. A novel she had mentioned, a property matter in Yorkshire he was untangling, The Bristol spring tides that affected the harbour schedule. Ordinary things. The kind of talking that happened between people who had agreed, without stating it, to stay in the same room for as long as the evening allowed. He asked her when it was nearly 11 o'clock, and the fire had burned lower and the wine was finished. He did not stand up to do it. He said it across the table, in the same even voice he used for commercial negotiations, which she understood was not indifference, but the register he used for things that mattered. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I want to ask it plainly, not because I think the answer is simple, but because I find I am not capable of asking it any other way." She waited. "Would you marry me?" The room was quiet. Outside, Grosvenor Street was doing what streets did at nearly 11 on a Thursday evening in May. "You want to ask it plainly," she said. "I do." "Then I will answer you plainly." She looked at him. "I need to think." He did not look disappointed. He looked, she thought, as though he had expected exactly this and had already decided it was acceptable. "How long?" he said. "A week." "A week," he said. "Yes." She stood. He stood. He walked her to the entrance hall and her coat was brought and he held the door himself. "The ledger," he said as she stepped out. She turned. He was holding it out to her. She had left it on the reading table. She took it from him. His fingers brushed hers in the transfer, brief, not accidental. "Thursday," she said. "Our meeting is Thursday." "Yes," he said, "it is." She went down the steps to the waiting hackney. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could feel him still in the doorway. In the cab, in the dark, she held the ledger in her lap and looked out at the London night and thought about a man who had walked into her Bristol office with a contract designed to consume her, and who had, over 4 months of being wrong about her, become someone she did not want to be without. She thought about that for the whole of the journey. She thought about it in bed and in the morning, and she went to the window and looked out at Holborn, no harbour, no ships, no whales in the distance, and thought about it still. A week, she had said. She already knew the answer. She had known it if she was accurate about these things, since the moment he had called her by her name. The week was not for thinking. The week was for being certain she was choosing and not being swept. There was a difference. She had learned the hard way that there was a difference. She also needed to write to Hartley. She sat at the Holborn writing table and drafted the letter that evening, before she had eaten supper or lit more than one candle. She told Hartley she required the equitable trust papers to be complete and ready for signature before any other legal instrument was drawn. She told him she required them to be watertight. Rowe and Associates held in trust for her sole and separate use, independent of any future marriage, not subject to any husband's direction or disposal, in perpetuity. She sealed the letter and set it by the door for Thomas to post in the morning. Then she lit the second candle and went to find something to eat, and did not examine the fact that she had written to Hartley before she had written to anyone else. London, May-June 1817. The crisis arrived on the Monday, 4 days into her week. It came in the form of a letter from Thomas, forwarded from Bristol, written in his careful hand with the particular formality he used when the contents alarmed him. A merchant named Crail, James Crail of Crail and Whitmore, Bristol, had filed a petition with the Bristol Merchant Society's Arbitration Committee challenging the proposed partnership on the grounds of procedural irregularity in Haverford's license extension. The license, renewed in December, had been granted under a provision that Crail's petition argued did not cover joint commercial operations with non-licensed parties. He was requesting a formal committee hearing before any May signing could proceed. Diana read the letter standing at the Holborn writing table. Then she read it again. She knew from the moment she finished the second reading 3 things. First, the petition was not a good-faith procedural challenge. Crail had been attempting since Robert's death to acquire the Bristol merchant contacts she now held and had been refused twice. This was interference dressed as legality. Second, the procedural question he had raised was not without merit. The license provision was ambiguous. She had identified the ambiguity herself in February and had assumed, without verifying, that Haverford's legal team had resolved it. Third, if the petition was not answered within 21 days, the arbitration committee could issue a stay on the partnership pending hearing, which would delay the May signing indefinitely and give Crail time to move on her contacts directly. She sat down. She opened the ledger. She began to write. By the afternoon, she had a plan. It required 2 things: A formal legal response from Haverford's solicitor citing the correct statutory provision, which she had found after 2 hours with a legal digest from the hotel's small reading room, and a direct approach to 3 of her senior merchant contacts, asking them to submit letters of commercial intent to the committee, demonstrating that the partnership had operational substance, not merely theoretical form. She could arrange the second herself. The first required Haverford. She wrote him a note, short, factual, the emergency outlined in 3 sentences. She sent it with Thomas at 4 o'clock. He arrived at her lodgings at 6. She had not, she realized when she opened the door, planned for what it would be like to see him after Thursday evening. The week was not finished. The question was still technically open, and he was here in her sitting room doorway with his coat still on and her note in his hand, reading her face the way he read documents. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He read the letter from Thomas while she talked. He asked 2 questions, the statutory provision she had found and the timeline for the arbitration committee's review process, and she answered both. "I can have Fitch file the response tomorrow morning," he said. "Before you do, read the provision I found, page 42 of the digest." She pushed the book across the table. Fitch's original advice missed it. He read it. "Yes," he said, "he did. The merchant letters are more urgent than the legal response," she said. "Crail's real aim is the contacts. If they file letters of intent first, the petition becomes a procedural nuisance rather than a substantive challenge. You have already drafted the letters. I drafted the outline. They will want to write them in their own hand. Can you reach them in time?" "I can reach 2 by tomorrow. The 3rd is in Bristol. I will need to send Thomas tonight." She looked at him. "I have already written to Thomas." He set down the digest. He was looking at her in a way she recognized from the library, the unguarded version of him, the one that did not arrive with the professional architecture. "You had most of this solved before you wrote to me," he said. "I needed the legal arm," she said. "That is yours." "But the strategy is mine." "Yes." She met his eyes. "That is what this partnership is." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence he used as pressure, the other one, the one she had learned to distinguish, which meant he was taking something in. "I should have reviewed the license provision myself in February," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I relied on Fitch." "You relied on Fitch," she agreed. She said it without accusation. He heard it without defense. "That will not happen again." "No," she said, "it will not." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not the careful gesture from Thursday, not the entrance hall touch. A plain, steady pressure. "Here." She turned her hand under his and held it. "The week," he said. "I know. I am not pressing you." "I know that too." He withdrew his hand and stood and picked up his coat. "I will have Fitch's response filed by 9 tomorrow morning. Send me the merchant letters when you have them, and I will add a covering note on Haverford letterhead." "That will help," she said. "Diana." He paused at the door. The threshold pause, the one she knew, and looked back. "I should have reviewed it myself. I know that, and I am grateful you found it." "You are welcome," she said. He left. She sat at the writing table for a moment, then opened the ledger and wrote the date and below it, "Crail petition, legal gap, mine to find, his to file." Note, he did not argue about who had solved it. He simply said, "Thank you." She paused. He said, "Thank you." She closed the ledger and went to find Thomas. The merchant letters arrived at the arbitration committee on Wednesday. Fitch's legal response arrived Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the petition was reclassified from a substantive challenge to a procedural query, to be reviewed in the ordinary course of committee business, which meant in practice after the May signing. Not before. Crail's move had failed. Diana learned this from a note from Fitch, copied to her for the first time rather than addressed to Haverford for forwarding, at 3 o'clock on Thursday. Their meeting was at 4. She arrived at Grosvenor Street with the note in her pocket and the ledger under her arm and, tucked inside the ledger's back cover, a sealed letter from Hartley that had arrived that morning from Bristol. She had read it twice on the way over. It contained 4 pages of closely written legal description and ended with a single plain sentence. "The instrument is ready for signature at your direction, Mrs. Rowe." Haverford was in the library. He had been there for some time. There was a cup of cold coffee on the reading table and 3 documents spread in his working arrangement. He looked up when she came in. "Fitch's note." I received it at noon. He looked at her. It is over. For now, Crail will try again. Let him try again. He said it with a quietness that was not dismissal but certainty. He will find the ground less open. She sat down. He sat. The fire was lit. She had noticed he always lit it when she was expected, even on mild days. I want to tell you something, she said. He waited. When Robert died, his man of business, Prentice, who had been with him 15 years, came to me the morning after the funeral. He sat in the parlour in Queen Square and told me, very kindly, that the business was not in a condition to survive without significant intervention, and that in his professional assessment, the sensible course was to sell the remaining assets, settle the debts, and... She stopped. He used the phrase, return to a more suitable sphere of activity. Haverford said nothing. His face said nothing. He was entirely still. I asked him what assets were recoverable. He told me. I thanked him for his time and I asked him to leave, and I sat in the parlour for a very long time, and then I went to Robert's desk, and I found the ledger, his ledger, which I stripped and rebound, and I opened it to the first page and I began. I know, Haverford said. She looked at him. You know. I have known since the second meeting in Bristol. The ledger is not a mourning object, it never was. And you said nothing. It was not mine to say. She held his gaze. The reason I could not trust you, when I say I could not afford to, I mean it precisely. Every man who has arrived at my desk in the past 18 months, merchants, solicitors, Prentice, your own Mr. Fitch, arrived with a version of the same offer. That I was temporary, that I was holding something on behalf of the next arrangement, that my judgment was provisional. She paused. I have had no reason in 18 months to believe that any man of rank or standing was arriving at my desk for any purpose other than eventual acquisition. The word sat in the room. And I arrived in January, he said, with a contract containing clause 19. Yes, she said, you did. I removed it. You removed it when I named it. That is different from not writing it. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. Outside, Grosvenor Street went about its afternoon. You are right, he said. It is different. Edmund. It was the first time she had used his name. She heard herself use it and did not retract it. I am not telling you this to wound you. I am telling you because you asked me to think for a week. And I have been thinking, and what I have concluded is that I cannot say yes to you without you understanding what it costs me. What trusting someone costs when you have learned that it comes at a price. He stood up from his chair and crossed to her side of the table and crouched down so that they were at eye level, and he looked at her with the unarmored face, the one she had first seen in this room, the one she thought he showed almost no one. Tell me what you need, he said. She reached into the ledger and took out Hartley's letter and set it on the table between them. He looked at it without touching it. What is this? The marriage settlement, she said, drawn by a Bristol solicitor named Hartley. It places Rowan Associates in an equitable trust for my sole and separate use. It cannot be directed, transferred or disposed of by a husband. It exists independent of any marriage in perpetuity. She looked at him steadily. I need you to read it, and I need you to sign it, before I name a date. He picked it up. He read it, all 4 pages, slowly, with the same attention he gave every document that mattered. She watched him read. She did not look away. He reached the last page. He set it down. You wrote to Hartley before you had given me your answer, he said. Yes. Before you knew what your answer would be. I knew what my answer would be, she said. I needed to know that saying yes would not cost me everything else. He was very still for a moment, then he said, Have you a pen? She opened the ledger and took out the pen she kept inside the cover and held it out to him. He took it. He turned to the last page of Hartley's document, found the signature line, and signed his name in the compressed black hand she knew from the bottom of Fitch's letters, the one that had first written, The India sourcing documentation was satisfactory. He set the pen down. He looked at her. I want to be clear about something, he said. I am not signing this because you required it. I am signing it because it is correct. What is yours is yours. It was always yours. The law is an ass on the matter, and I have no intention of being its instrument. She looked at the signature on Hartley's page for a moment. Then she looked at him. Yes, she said. Yes? Yes, she said, I will marry you. He let out a breath, brief, barely audible, the sound of a man who had been holding something very carefully and had been allowed to set it down. He took her hand and held it, and she held his, and the fire burned and the ledger was on the table, Hartley's signed papers folded inside it, and it was not a dramatic scene. It was a scene between two people who had been circling something true for 4 months and had finally, in a Mayfair library on a Thursday afternoon in May, arrived at it. The Bristol Merchant Assembly was on the 14th of June. It was the first time they appeared together publicly, not as rumour or implication, but as fact, as partners walking into a room together and standing at the same table and being introduced to the same people. Diana wore dark blue. Haverford wore Haverford, meaning he arrived in a room and the room adjusted, which she had seen him do 20 times, and which still, she found, landed differently when she was standing next to him rather than across from him. Morrison was there, the shipping agent from the February dinner. He shook her hand and then Haverford's, and his face performed the calculation that most people's faces performed in the first 10 seconds, which was to determine whether this was a social arrangement or a commercial one. Both, Diana said, which she had not planned to say aloud, and Morrison laughed and Haverford turned to look at her with an expression she had not catalogued because it was new, something pleased and surprised, quickly controlled. She filed it for later. The assembly lasted 3 hours. She moved through it doing what she had always done, working the room, the merchants, the contacts, the web of Bristol trade that she had spent 18 months building one conversation at a time. Haverford stayed near enough that they could speak when required, and far enough that she was not operating in his shadow. She appreciated this with a precision she could not have articulated in February. Near the end of the evening, standing with a group of 4 merchants she knew well, she looked across the room and found him already looking at her. He raised his glass, fractionally. She turned back to her conversation. In the carriage afterward, his carriage now rather than a hired hack, she said, "You were useful tonight." "Useful," he said. "You introduced Hargrave to the Cape route discussion. He would not have raised it with me present. He considers me a specialized opinion." "He considers you a great many things he is unlikely to voice within my hearing," Haverford said. "Now that he knows you will not be presenting those opinions alone." She looked at him. "Is that why you came?" "I came," he said, "because it was a professional engagement relevant to our partnership." A pause. "And because I did not want you to be in that room without someone who understood what they were looking at." She reached across the carriage seat and took his hand. He looked down at their hands and then up at her face. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "Stop being careful with what you say. You can just say things." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "I came because I wanted to see you work." "Better," she said. He turned her hand in his and held it, and the carriage moved through the Bristol night, and through the window the harbour lights were on the water, and Diana looked at them and thought that she had stood at the window of the King Street office and watched a carriage arrive 5 months ago and had been in every way that mattered a different woman. Not a better one, not a worse one, the same woman with better information. Bristol and London, June-July 1817. The final negotiation was not supposed to happen without him. That was not anyone's intention. It was Creil's doing, specifically the particular spite of a man who had tried the arbitration committee and failed, and had now arranged, through a contact Diana had not previously identified as hostile, to move the hearing date forward by 2 days without informing Haverford's office. The Bristol Merchant Society's committee had agreed to a formal review session on the Friday. She received the revised notice on a Tuesday morning. Haverford was in Yorkshire, dealing with an estate matter that had been deferred twice already and could not be deferred again. The hearing was Thursday. She sent him a note. She did not wait for a reply. Then she opened the ledger and prepared. The session was held at a solicitor's office on Corn Street, neutral ground, as such things were conducted in Bristol, with the committee providing the arbitrating body and both parties presenting their positions. Creil was there with 2 men Diana did not recognize, and one she did, a senior committee member named Sims, a prosperous Bristol linen merchant who sat on the Society's commercial disputes panel and had the wary look of a man who suspected he had not been correctly briefed for what was about to occur. On Diana's side, herself Thomas with the documentation, and Hartley, who had come up from his offices 2 streets away and who set his case on the table with the quiet satisfaction of a solicitor who had been preparing for exactly this. Creil looked at her side of the table and said pleasantly, "I had expected the Duke to attend." "His Grace sends his regards," Diana said, which was not a lie. His reply had arrived that morning, express from Yorkshire. I will be there Thursday. Do not let them reframe the terms. E. He was not there Thursday. She would not let them reframe the terms. Crayle's position, set out by his solicitor in the opening, was this: that the proposed partnership, while now procedurally compliant with the society's requirements, was commercially structured in a way that disadvantaged the wider Bristol trade community by concentrating a disproportionate share of licensed routes in a single partnership. He was proposing a revised arrangement that would require Haverford to make 3 of the 6 routes available to open tender among Bristol merchants. It was clever. Diana would give him that. The procedural challenge had failed, so he had shifted to a commercial harm argument, which sounded, to someone unfamiliar with the specifics, like a reasonable concern for the community's welfare. She let him finish. She let his solicitor finish. She let Sims ask 2 clarifying questions and receive 2 answers, and then she opened the ledger. Mr. Sims, she said, I would like to address the commercial harm argument directly, because I believe it is the only substantive question before us today. Sims looked at her with the expression of a committee member, recalibrating his expectations of the next hour. The claim, she continued, is that concentrating these 6 routes in a single partnership disadvantages competitive Bristol trade. I want to show you what the competitive landscape for those routes currently looks like. She set the ledger open on the table and nodded to Thomas, who distributed 3 pages of figures to everyone present, her figures sourced, verified, annotated in her hand. These are the current operators on each route, she said. The Calcutta run 3 operators, 2 of whom are London-based and hold no Bristol licenses. The Cape, 2 operators, both London. The Bombay connection, currently unlicensed from Bristol, which is precisely why this partnership was formed. She looked at Sims. The harm argument requires that there be an existing competitive Bristol market, which this partnership would damage. There is no such market. What exists is a London-dominated licensing structure that has, for 6 years, systematically excluded Bristol merchants from the most profitable routes. This partnership, Bristol-based merchant operations holding licenses through a British peer, is the first arrangement of its kind to return that business to this city. She turned a page. Mr. Crayle's firm operates on none of these 6 routes. His commercial interest in this proceeding is not the protection of Bristol trade. It is the prevention of a competitor from occupying ground he has not been willing to develop himself. Crayle's solicitor began to speak. Crayle put a hand on the table. He looked at Diana with the expression of a man who had underestimated something and was arriving at that conclusion in real time. The figures, Crayle said. Where are these from? From the merchants themselves, Diana said, as always. Sims cleared his throat. He looked at the 3 pages in front of him. He looked at Crayle's solicitor. He looked back at the pages. Crayle's solicitor made 3 more points. Diana answered each with a page reference. The third she answered with a document that Crayle's side had not seen and had not anticipated, a letter from the Bristol Merchant Society's own Trade Records Committee, obtained 2 days prior, confirming that no existing Bristol operator had applied for licenses on the relevant routes in the preceding 3 years. Hartley, beside her, had not known about that letter until she placed it on the table. She heard him draw a very quiet breath. Sims called a recess. He came back 12 minutes later and said that in his assessment and that of his fellow panel members, the commercial harm argument was not substantiated by the evidence presented, and that his recommendation to the full committee would be to allow the partnership to proceed to formal signing without further challenge. Crayle said nothing. His solicitor made a note. The official record of the session was concluded in 5 minutes. She was in the entrance hall of the Corn Street office, pulling on her gloves when the door opened. Haverford. He had ridden from Yorkshire. She could see it in him. The travel dust not entirely removed, a tension around his eyes that was not quite exhaustion. He took in the entrance hall, Crayle's group leaving through the far door, Sims speaking quietly to a fellow committee member, Hartley packing his case with the satisfied efficiency of a solicitor whose client had just prevailed. His eyes came to Diana. "It's done," she said. He crossed the hall. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face, and she looked at his. And between them was everything the last 6 months had contained: the January contract, the 2 hours and 11 minutes, the carriage in February rain, the shared desk, the ledger read without permission and replaced without comment. The step in the Wednesday entrance hall, the library dinner, the signed papers in the back of the ledger. The word yes spoken on a Thursday afternoon in May. "Tell me," he said. She told him, concisely in order, the way she told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The trade records letter," he said. "When did you get that?" "Wednesday evening." "You went to the records committee on Tuesday." "I went to Morrison on Tuesday. He knew who to ask." He looked at her, the unarmored face entirely present, not a trace of the architectural composure that had once been his default expression in rooms like this. "Diana," he said, and then without irony, without performance, without the weight of rank or the distance of manner. "That was the most impressive thing I have witnessed in my adult life." She looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a managed one. It came from somewhere unguarded, from relief and the accumulated improbability of the last 6 months, and it filled the Corn Street entrance hall and made Hartley look up from his case and quickly find something else to examine. Haverford watched her laugh, and something in his face settled deeply, the way the last piece of a thing settles when it has finally found where it belongs. He took her hand. "Come," he said. "I want coffee and a fire and you to tell me the whole thing from the beginning." "You already know the whole thing." "I want to hear you tell it." She picked up the ledger from the side table where she had set it, and she took his arm, and they walked out of the Corn Street office into the Bristol June afternoon, and the harbour was there at the end of the street, and the ships, and on a very clear day, the suggestion of Wales. The wedding was in the first week of July in Bristol, at the church on Park Street that Diana had attended since childhood, and which she had therefore chosen without consulting anyone who might have opinions about London churches. It was a Tuesday. There were 16 guests. That morning in the parlour of the Queen Square house, they were alone before they were required to leave. The furniture was still Robert's. She had not yet moved it, though she would. The ledger was on the writing desk in the corner. Haverford was standing at the window. Not the harbour window, this one faced the square, the trees, the ordinary Bristol morning. He turned when she came in. She was in pale gold, which had been her own decision and which Mrs. Albright had endorsed with an enthusiasm, suggesting she had been waiting months to offer it. Her hair was up. She wore no jewellery that had been Robert's. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. He crossed the room and took her hands and looked at her with the expression she had by now fully catalogued and would never tire of, the one that had no name in his professional taxonomy, because it had not existed until her. "I want to say something," he said, "before we go." "Then say it." "In January," he said, "I arrived in Bristol with a contract I had not read carefully enough, and an assumption about what the meeting would be. I had decided before I arrived what you were." He paused. "I was wrong about every part of it, and I want you to know that I know that. Not as a performance of contrition, as a plain fact." She looked at him. "I know you know it." "I know you know. I wanted to say it anyway." She reached up and straightened his cravat, which did not need straightening, and he let her do it, and when she stepped back, her hands were still at his lapels, and his were at her waist, and the morning light came through the parlour window, and the ledger was on the desk in the corner, and everything was very quiet and entirely itself. "Shall we go," she said, "and get married?" "Yes," he said, "let's." 6 weeks on in the parlour of the Queen Square house, on a morning in mid-August, the writing desk had been replaced with a wider one, walnut, room enough for 2, and it sat now in the corner where the old one had been, in front of the window that faced the square. On the left side of the desk, a column of figures in Diana's handwriting, the Bombay Factors revised tonnage projections, annotated in the margins with 3 questions she intended to put to Haverford before noon. On the right side, those same questions already answered. He had been there before her that morning, had seen the annotations, and had written his responses in the compressed black hand she knew from the bottom of Fitch's letters, the one that had first written, "The India sourcing documentation was satisfactory." The ledger was open between their 2 sides, her entries on the left-hand page, his notes on the facing right. Thomas was at King Street, managing the harbour correspondence and the daily operational rhythm with the quiet competence he had been developing since March. The contacts were Diana's. The strategy was Diana's. The decisions that mattered, the supplier negotiations, the route approvals, the letters that required her particular intelligence, were hers, conducted from this desk, From this room, from the house that had once been too large and too full of another man's furniture, and that was now incrementally and then all at once becoming something else. Haverford came in from the hall with a letter and set it beside her cup without interrupting what she was writing. She finished the line. "What is it?" "The Calcutta factor. He wants an answer on the spring cargo by September. We have the September figures. Thomas sent them yesterday. They are in the Tuesday correspondence." She found the relevant page, read it, made a note. "Tell him yes, the spring cargo at the agreed rate, with the penalty clause if he misses the March window. I will write to him this afternoon." He sat. He looked at the open ledger, her entries, his, the pages covered in the combined record of what they had built. He looked at it the way he had always looked at it, with the attention that had once made her catalogue it and had later made her understand what it meant. She turned a page. "The Bombay connection. Hargrave wants to come in as a junior partner. What do you think?" She considered. "I think he is competent and honest and would bring 2 useful contacts on the Gujarat route. I think we should offer him a 2-year trial with a defined share and a clear exit provision if it does not suit." "Done," he said. She wrote it down. Outside, the square was going about its August morning. Somewhere on the Avon, a ship was making its way to the harbour mouth. Diana did not need to be at the King Street window to know it. She had the harbour in her, the way you had things that had been the fixed point of your days for long enough. December. A dinner at the Queen Square House, Bristol, during the winter visit south. 12 guests, the kind of table Diana set now. Prosperous Bristol merchants and their wives, a couple of minor local gentry, the Albrights, Hartley and his wife, Morrison. Haverford at one end, Diana at the other, the fire going well and the candles lit and the room warm against the December outside. The food was good. The conversation moved the way it did at good dinners, doubling back on itself and occasionally producing something worth keeping. A young man named Ferrers, recently come into a small Bristol trading concern through an uncle's will and not yet certain what to do with it, was seated 3 places from Diana. He was pleasant enough and genuinely curious about commerce, which she appreciated. He had been talking to Hartley about contract law for 20 minutes. Toward the end of the main course, he turned to the woman on his other side, Mrs. Albright as it happened, and said with the comfortable confidence of someone who had not yet learned to measure his observations against his company, "I have always thought there was something admirable in a woman who takes an interest in commercial matters, so long as it remains an interest, naturally. The professional sphere requires a particular sort of mind." Mrs. Albright looked at her plate. Morrison, across the table, developed a sudden interest in his wine glass. Haverford set down his fork. "Ferrers," he said. His voice was entirely pleasant, which was, Diana had learned, when it was most precise. "You are 3 places from my wife, who is the most accomplished commercial negotiator, currently working out of Bristol, who built the partnership that holds 6 licensed trade routes this city had not seen in a decade, and who last June presented a case to the Merchant Society's Arbitration Committee that closed a petition most men of business would have taken a fortnight to answer." He picked up his fork. "I would revisit the observation." The table was quiet for 1 beat. Ferrers coloured to his collar. Yes, quite, I beg your pardon, Your Grace, and Mrs." He looked at Diana, uncertain of the form. "The Duchess of Haverford," Hartley said from 3 seats away, with the serene helpfulness of a man enjoying himself. "Yes, I beg your pardon, Your Grace." Diana at the other end of the table was looking at her husband. He met her eyes across the 12 of them, across the candles and the Bristol December and the guests arranged between them, and his expression was the one she had catalogued last, the one that had no professional name. She raised her glass fractionally. He looked back at his plate. Mrs. Albright leaned toward Diana. "I said so in February," she murmured. "You will recall I said so." "You did," Diana said. "You were entirely right." The dinner continued. Ferrers recovered and spent the second half of the evening asking Morrison about the Cape route with genuine interest, which Diana thought was the most useful possible outcome for everyone. Late that night in the parlour, their parlour now, the writing desk with its 2 sides and the wide window facing the square, Diana was at the desk with the ledger open in front of her. The house was quiet. The fire was the only light she needed. Haverford came in, coat off, the domestic version of him that she had had 6 months to learn and had not yet finished learning. He sat in the chair beside her rather than across, which he had started doing in August. He looked at the ledger. "Working." Finishing. He looked at the page. Her handwriting, the day's entries, the Bristol figures and the Bombay notes, and the Calcutta correspondence logged and answered. A full page, the record of everything they had built and were still building. "Ferrers," she said. "Yes." "You did not need to." "I know. He is young. He would have reconsidered quietly." "No doubt." He looked at the open ledger. "I did not want him to reconsider quietly." She turned to look at him. He was close enough that it required no particular movement, a simple adjustment, the leaning in that had become familiar between two people who had decided to be in each other's company indefinitely. She kissed him. He kissed her back. In the grate, the fire settled and the room was warm and full of the Bristol winter outside and the work on the desk between them. She reached over and turned the ledger page. A fresh page, blank, waiting for tomorrow's entries. She picked up the pen.
If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.